a notification asking you to accept that it's being recorded, so you can go ahead and click that. So I've shared a slide, not because we're actually going to go through these slides, but these are slides that you see screen shared here that have a lot of good pre-prepared material that we might end up referencing at some point during the Q&A today. And so let's see, guidelines. So here's how we're going to do our process, what has worked pretty well in the past. So please go ahead and you can begin to type your questions into the Zoom chat, and we'll just go top to bottom and answer as many as we can in the time that we have. And if you have a question that's kind of too tough or difficult to ask in text, you can just say, I have a question about, and then but generally describe the nature of the question, the general topic, and then I'll look to call on you, and you can, if you so choose, come off mute and verbally share that if that works better. Some other pointers: concise factual questions tend to work better for the Q&A format. Super specific questions that might be super unique, we could take a crack at maybe, but you're also welcome to just follow that link or go to my website and go to the contact webpage and just let me know what the question is. And if I can give you a brief answer, be happy to do that. So those are some guidelines for the Q&A. And I'll say lastly that these questions up here on this slide are some of the most common that we get every year. And in 2021, we did a different Q&A panel where we went through for the first 35 minutes in rapid fire, answered all these core questions. And so if you're looking for a nice, tight, highly dense presentation on key information covering these questions, that link, or you can scan that QR code, will take you to the YouTube recording, and so you could always watch that later because that'll have a lot of good prepared information. So we hope what we covered today will enhance and build on some of that stuff. But the floor is now open. The four of us co-presenters have our eye on the Zoom chat, so feel free to pop your questions into the Zoom chat, and we will answer them one by one. Don't be shy. So I will give folks a while to do that. And in terms of, as you're typing stuff in terms of who of the four of us will seek to answer these questions, we'll just try to tag team to work together to provide a professor and a grad student perspective. And some of us may take a bigger or smaller lead on certain topics, depending on what it is. But since I have a lot of videos and stuff, and I've talked a lot in other spheres, I'll let the grad students lead as much as possible to the degree they feel comfortable, since several of us haven't been on a Q&A in the past for this. Yes, Cece, you asked a great question about enabling closed captions. That may be something that I, as host, have to do. So let's see.
It is something you have to do, Dr. Hammer. I can't do it from co-host status. Would you like us to go ahead and start with this first question?
Yes, why don't you do that?
So the first question I see in the chat is, what is the tuition and other associated costs for out-of-state students? Which is a phenomenal and very important question. Of course, that's going to depend state to state, where you're located, all those nuanced factors. But there is usually a pretty considerable difference between in-state and out-of-state, including at the graduate level. Do my peers have anything to add to that particular point? Yes, so this next question I see is from Lee Taylor. I'm a junior in my undergraduate psychology program at Samford University right now. I'm very passionate about counseling psychology, and I want to pursue a PhD in the field. Where should I begin to look for the right program for me? How do I apply, and who should I contact at each university to establish the connection there? I'll pass that to my colleagues here and see if I need to add anything at the end.
So the way I went about applying for different programs was that actually I went on YouTube and I went on Google and I was like, how do I start applying for counseling psychology programs? And actually I saw Dr. Hammer's YouTube series about how to apply to counseling psychology programs. And it was really helpful, not only because I knew that the path I wanted to go to was a PhD as well and in counseling psychology, but it just helped me like establish a path in terms of like, okay, I want to become a licensed psychologist colleges? What are the steps that I need to take? And I won't go into like too much of the details right now, just because I think he explains it a lot better in his YouTube series. But in terms of establishing a connection, I think what I did was it helped me to brainstorm what kind of research I envision myself doing for the next however many years. And I realized that my passions were in mental health, and especially that relating to queer Asians. So then I started reading a bunch of papers related to that, and also just in terms of like mental health in general. And I identified professors who did research in the general area in counseling psychology that I wanted to do research in, or professors who specialize in those areas more. And I sent them emails and try to establish connections that way. I hope that helps. And Joshua, if you have anything to add.
You covered most of what I would say. Again, Dr. Hammer has so much on his website. He has specific etiquette on how to contact those professors and when, and in order to establish that relationship for PhD. I'll also add that many programs you can actually find, they post statistics of what their alumni go off to do. So in addition, if you're looking at specific programs, many of them will actually have that data. If you're looking for a specific thing you want to do with that degree.
Only kind of nuance I would add to some of that is there's a really great resource for people who are thinking about PhD or PsyDs called the Insider's Guide to Clinical and Counseling Psychology. I found that really helpful, and I recommend it to people because it lists places by interest as well as by degree type, which can be really meaningful as you sort through some of this. We are geared towards talking about PhDs and PsyDs here today, but there are really considerable differences and different options in career paths. If you see yourself mostly being a clinician versus mostly a researcher, it changes the answer. And the other piece I would add about contacting at the university is reach out to graduate students. Reach out to graduate students. We tend to give I'm biased, but I think we give some of the best advice and realistic look as to what it means to be a graduate student in that program. And most people will respond to you for the most part. Anything you would add to that, Dr. Hammer, before we go to this next one?
No, I think that's solid. And just as a moment of presenter transparency, I'm gonna pause recording for a second because I'm trying to find the captions button so I can enable captions, but it's not displaying that for me as host. So I'm gonna see if maybe if I just pause recording to so I'll have to make a note to myself to set that up for next year. So thank you for your help with that, and my apologies you all for that. So what is our next question here in the list? Somebody help orient me since I've been messing with Zoom.
The next question is really good and branches off the last. So do I need a doctorate degree to be a counselor, or is a master's enough? To practice clinically, a master's is absolutely enough. I actually do not recommend doing a PhD unless you see research as an integral part of what you want to do as a profession. I think people fall into that trap sometimes, but unless you want to do research or something that requires a PhD, a master's is usually a really good fit for people who see themselves working primarily in a talk therapy clinician role.
I'll also jump in very quickly. Unique to this program, our master's program for counseling psychology, the 2 years, does not lead to accreditation at the end. So you would not be able to practice as a counselor at that point. This program is built specifically to help prep you for a doctoral application, whether PhD or PsyD or however else you want to go. But there are other programs that would allow a master's, and then you might just for a while with the master's and then continue to a PhD or PsyD if you wish to later. But this program specifically is really built to springboard you into that doctoral application.
There's a lot of differences between master's programs too, and underline Josh's point of accreditation is key. Accreditation from state to state versus outside of the US, it's all different rules and regulations. So make sure that you are thinking strategically when you're gathering that information before you even apply. This next question is about what careers are available. That is a very big answer. Psychology is flexible, which is both a blessing and a curse, I think. sometimes it feels so open that it's like, okay, where do we even start when I'm thinking about graduate school? And on the other side of that, with a PhD in psychology, we'll be able to teach. We can do what Dr. Hammer does and work at a big research institution, do a lot of research. People go into private practice, work clinically, work at university centers. People go into nonprofit organizations, think tank research. And some of us end up working in more marketing spaces like industrial organizational psychology. They pull from all sorts of psych programs. So it's a really flexible field. I know there are things I am missing though. What would y'all add to that, just in possibilities with these degrees?
Did you mention community mental health centers, Melanie? Yeah, so if you like working with the community, that's another way you can give back and work as a psychologist or a community mental health clinician. Yeah, I don't know if there's any more I would add to that, but yeah, the job market is very diverse.
You may have already mentioned it, but some form of career consultation as well can be something that you can also engage in.
And for stuff like like user experience, UX design, people who need a little bit of research background and skills to help companies or websites make sure that their digital infrastructure or workflow or system is set up in a way that enhances users' experience, because it's good to know something about how humans think and be able to do focus groups and a little bit of qualitative data collection to get people's experience with using a product. And a lot of the stuff that you learn are soft skills or people skills very deeply in this, and those can be applied pretty broadly. So yeah, great question. What is next?
What are the expected requirements for applying? So this one's going to change a lot too, depending on what type of program you're applying to. For the PhD level, it is expected that people have some pretty solid research experience at different stages of research. Clinical expectations vary, and then master's levels expectations vary too. But I would come prepared with a strong resume and CV that really focuses on your transferable skills, and a personal statement is also usually required. There's a lot of nuance there, though.
I'd also like to add, unique to this program, and Dr. Hammer actually has a video about, do you need a psych background for a master's as opposed to a PhD? It's one of the many YouTube videos he has. For my situation, I actually had a BFA in music theater and applied for the master's program here. So they will actually state when applying for the master's here that they just want to see a demonstration of those soft people skills that Dr. Hammer just mentioned. So writing where you have those interpersonal skills, where you got them from, demonstrations of it, and then also letters of recommendation that augment or amplify those. But generally, master's is going to be a little more flexible towards that. PhD and PsyD maybe less so. PhD obviously will want to see research experience. PsyD is going to want to see some clinical experience on the CV. But masters can be flexible, again, depending on the program.
I also wanted to jump in and say that you shouldn't feel limited to applying for PhD programs because you don't have a complete background in psychology, because I actually was a literature and creative writing major as an undergrad, and I had a minor in psychology, but then I had different research experiences and clinical experiences working in counseling. And my research experiences were more in social psychology, but I still applied and got into the Hammer Lab. So I don't want those to be like, if you don't have a psych major, if you didn't do something that you feel like is like enough to apply for PhD programs, I don't want that to be something that stops you from trying in the first place.
I'll also add one more point. The requirements as far as GRE are somewhat changing in our culture right now, again, depending on the program. For ours, it is not a requirement, though there is one professor that does ask for it if you want to work with them with research at this time. But for the most part, again, check the program, check what's being discussed. But the GRE is being valued less and less as a requirement.
And I'll add to that, for PhD programs, they want to see both like the makings of a good future clinician, good people skills, empathy skills, and for PhD programs that are scientist practitioner, you got to be both a practitioner and a scientist. They want to see those burgeoning research skills, which typically involves involvement in a research lab. And things like that, and ideally like some independent study or a capstone project or an undergraduate thesis or things like that. But if it's a PsyD program, which is focused almost completely on practice, then you don't have to have as much research experience. You just have to have the makings of a good clinician. And then if it's a master's program in a lot of applied mental health fields like counseling or clinical social work or counseling psych or whatnot, then it's kind of similar to the PsyD. Like, would you have the makings of a good clinician? Yeah. What is next here? How does the counseling psych graduate program differ on a day-to-day basis from undergrad? Wonderful question. And I should also, before jumping into that, a caveat that for this counseling psych Q&A, this is designed to give y'all perspective on counseling psychology as a specialty of psychology, just like clinical psych is a specialty. And so our purpose is to give you things that are reasonably true about the specialty area of counseling psychology. And we can certainly talk about our PhD in counseling psych here at University of Kentucky or our master's in counseling psych here at University of Kentucky. But our main focus is speaking to the profession, because we know y'all are going to be applying to many of the programs across the board. So just that sort of clarification. But swinging back around to this, how does it differ? You know, grad students, you are all the experts on this. So who wants to get us rolling?
Melanie, I'm not sure who you're pointing to, but
Yeah.
but I came in post-bac and I worked for a year and a half before coming, but I do feel like my undergrad experience, I do remember most of it. So I would say it's less like, as a grad student, I feel like I'm less focused on just classes, if that makes any sense. Like, I realize that I have my time equally or even more so divided between like research and classes, but I definitely don't just feel like a student. As an undergrad, I think my goal was to get like the best grades I could get and to establish like good relationships with professors for rec letters and such. But I feel like as a grad student, like, classes are not my main focus, even though they're still very important and I get a lot out of them. But I practice as a mental health professional in training with my peers in the counseling techniques class. I do a lot of research projects on the side, and then classes. There are certain assignments, but it's not like they take up like 80% of my time as a grad student, as opposed to being an undergrad. I hope that starts to kind of get at like the differences between an undergrad program and a grad program in counseling psych. I think Joshua and Melanie, if you have more to add to that.
So as a more advanced PhD student, it looks a little different too. So I usually think of it as 4 main components, and 3 of them are a little different than undergrad. So we have classes, your academics, we have clinical work. Both Cece and Joshua are in their first year, so they haven't started that in full yet. It's usually more like 20 hours a week. Most of us have assistantships, which vary a lot, but can offer different ways to pay for school or help with small stipends. And then you also have professional development. So again, classes, clinical work, assistantship, and professional development. And those wax and wane throughout your time. I'm focusing on the PhD experience, but they wax and wane. One of the key differences that I have found in terms of classes is that there's a different philosophy to teaching a lot of the times. In undergraduate, there's that traditional professor comes and teaches you. In graduate school, it's something called the flipped classroom approach, where there's a higher expectation that you will engage with the materials and kind of be able to teach yourself some of the skills and come to class prepared to discuss it and really deepen your understanding. And that was a really big switch for me coming back into graduate school, just the orientation of the classroom.
I'll add quickly that, depending on what your undergrad experience was, this will emphasize, in addition to research, actually developing those skills in real time. So again, there's less emphasis on the grades, but more being in the room, doing role play exercises, and actually developing those counseling techniques, at least in our first year. But that will continue into clinical and practical work as well. So the emphasis is less on your grade at the end of the semester and more, did you actually develop the skills that you'll eventually use in your profession?
Yeah, and I will add that it's really, if undergraduate can sometimes feel like your teachers or your professors are driving the bus and you're passengers, graduate school is really where that's flipped and you get in the driver's seat, and professors and supervisors and other folks are there to provide the consultation and the assistance and the map reading on your journey. But ultimately, there's a lot more adulting and responsibility that falls on your shoulders, which can be great and extremely scary and dicey at the same time, in that like it becomes important for you to be strategic about your time investments, because unfortunately, because of some structural issues about how education and higher education is set up in our country in particular, that you will feel the pressure to do more things than you have time in the week for. And you have to make very careful decisions about what to prioritize and what to deprioritize, what to skim instead of deep read, that sort of thing, because you literally can't do all the things and have enough time to sleep at night and eat. It shouldn't be that way. It's a structural problem, but it is currently that way. And so there's a lot of hidden curriculum into figuring out, how do I survive in an unhealthy higher education system to get this degree that will give me the power to do what I want to do and help the communities that I want to help. And so it's really helpful to have a mentor at fellow grad students and professors who can inform you of some of the hidden curriculum, because it is not friendly in many ways. It is not healthy in many ways, to be honest.
I underline that. Yeah, sometimes I get the question of like, how many hours a week do I do things? So typically, especially I'm done with classes, but earlier I'd probably spend 15 hours a week or so, maybe more like 15, 20 on classes and reading, 20 hours in clinical, 20 hours assistantship. So that's 60 right there. And then we have our research, our professional development, and your life outside of that. So scheduling and time management is a crucial key skill for graduate school, especially of this variety. The next question I see in here is, what can a PhD get you that you can't do with a PsyD? So one thing I didn't really understand until really being in the field is you can do the same stuff clinically, very similar. You'll be trained on the same assessments and be able to bill insurance at a doctoral level, which is significantly different for billing insurance at a master's level. But the key difference is that research component and how competitive you tend to be for more academic or research-oriented positions. So the philosophy of training is a little different, but in terms of career path, PhDs will assist you more if you see yourself in academic or research spaces. Anything y'all want to help differentiate those?
I'll add the caveat, and Dr. Hammer, please feel free to correct me with my understanding on this, but some PsyD positions, if you were looking to be in academia and like be a supervising position, there are some paths where you can do PsyD academically, but again, those are going to be less in research and more in like practice and skill development.
And I will say too, so I have here up on the slide some of the key differences to build on what folks said, that for folks who don't want to go the researchy or teaching route, which is one of the strongest strengths of getting a PhD, the other big strength that most people think about is that it's harder to get into PhDs, but you can get assistantships, which typically waive tuition, give a small stipend, some stuff like that. And so the amount of debt you accrue if you go to a PhD program is considerably less than if you go to a PsyD program. So for folks who want to go straight clinical and don't want to do the research or teacher stuff, the PhD has those fiscal advantages, tend to be smaller class sizes and other stuff. But if you don't like research, a PhD is not fun to try and slog through. It's not fun because you will have to do some legit research. It's a good question. What is next?
Next one is asking about extracurriculars. So I think we touched on this a bit when we were talking about what can help make you competitive for applications. But internships, volunteering, research, again, it depends on if you're looking for a PhD, a PsyD, a master's, a terminal master's, or not terminal master's. There's a lot of varieties. Focusing on the PhD, research will be your most helpful experience. Internships are also really helpful. They're pretty rare to find clinical internships at the undergrad level, but they look really good when you can get a hold of one. But I am further away from undergrad. So what do y'all think? What helps, do you think, get you into this next step?
Of course, research is great, and would probably be perhaps the one you should really try to aim for if you can of them all. But like I said, masters might be a bit more flexible depending on if it's terminal or not. As you get to PhD and PsyD, they're really gonna, well, PhD especially really expect that research component. But again, just look at each website of what program you're looking at. With our program, they do say that, if you have one weakness in one area, that doesn't necessarily immediately disqualify you if you have strengths in others. So again, really lead with your strengths, and then talk about what can that program do to help fill what are gaps in your CV. So, I want to apply at this school. What strengths are there that the school can provide that I can help them and they can help me?
Yeah, and I think to add to that, Joshua, I really like what you shared in terms of like the program, also what can it do for you? But in terms of the program that you're looking at, for example, UK is a very research focused program where we both get, I mean, we get trained to be a clinical practitioner, but we also have to focus a lot on research. So obviously having a substantial research background is going to boost your application a lot. So I think you would really want to cater your preparation stage to the kind of programs that you're looking to engage yourself in for the next maybe 4, maybe 5 to 6 years.
This next question is about teaching in psychology and how would one go about doing that. The short answer is it depends on if you want to teach at the collegiate level or high school. So there are a little bit different. I'm geared more towards collegiate. Most applications for teaching positions require about 16 to 20 graduate course hours at the master's level or higher. So the minimum requirement is usually about 2 or 3 years of graduate work. That being said, it is typically you're more competitive typically if you do have the PhD, just because it is a pretty competitive field to be in the first place. But even as a graduate student, I pretty regularly teach at local colleges, local community colleges, but it was getting my foot in the door that was the hardest part, and then it kind of comes from there. I also cannot stress enough the importance of networking and getting to know people who are doing those things so that you can have some insight into that process and application. I see a question in here about what type of counseling or clinical work can an undergrad do that would help them prepare for a graduate program in this area. We have touched on it a little bit, so I don't want to repeat too much. There are some clinical internships available. It varies greatly depending on the university that you're at for undergrad. There's also other kind of more creative ways to get indirect experience that's still building those transferable skills. And what I mean by transferable skills are things that will help you be a good clinician. So things with different types of facilitation and groups, community outreach. You can kind of get creative with it, but you want to look for opportunities where you're able to facilitate conversation among groups of people. And to the best degree possible, get some experience in actual clinical work. But how did y'all do that? How did Cece and Josh, how did you get any clinical experience before coming to grad school? If you did, not all of us come in with it.
Yeah, that's a great question. I worked as a peer counselor at my undergrad institution for around 3 to 4 years before applying to UK. And that helped a lot because I was supervised by my supervisor had a clinical social work degree. So she was a licensed clinical social worker. And then I was also supervised by counseling psychologist. But I would say like anything related to the mental health field would have been helpful. I think obviously being a peer counselor gave me a taste of what I would be doing in the future. But even internships related to the broader mental health field in general, I think would have been pretty helpful in kind of getting my foot in the door.
I'll try to be concise, but in the event of not having that counseling and clinical work, to quote Dr. Hammer, can you show in your application that you have the makings of a good clinician? And in my case, I wrote about, again, those transferable soft social skills in my professional life before as a performer and other things that could be applicable. And you can both do that in letters of recommendation, through reaching out to people who've seen you do that work, but also in your personal statement. I'll also add there are opportunities, depending on what university you're at, to get involved in research labs, even as a undergraduate senior. And while that's not technically counseling work, it is a way to get involved in the research stuff. And if you're interested in applying at that school, there might be an easier transition there as well if you want to remain in that lab.
That just jogs my memory of a really good point. What I did at my undergraduate university and what I work with Dr. Hammer to do now through some of our internships is there's sometimes opportunities to take a master's level course while you are an undergrad. So I took a master's level course that was teaching clinical skills as an undergrad. So I kind of got my foot in the door in that training. And I had that secondary benefit of, hey, I can do grad school. So I know those exist at UK because Dr. Hammer has built them out, at least in counseling psych, but they do exist. They're just, think about it creatively. Sometimes it just means being able to take a master's level class before you might even be in that program. That can be a really competitive edge.
Yeah, and I'll add that crisis hotlines, they're national. We do stuff on Zoom now. Like if you do a little bit of Googling, there are plenty of paraprofessional, you're not licensed or under the supervision of a license, but you're a paraprofessional where you can be, there's crisis hotlines everywhere that need volunteers, and they will train you deeply in the core skills that you learn in your first semester of grad school in like your techniques class. And so they're always looking for volunteers. And so that is something that I definitely recommend, and every student can have access to that sort of thing. And just think about, explore what community organizations who are helping out key populations, what organizations are around, who are they serving, what kind of volunteerism do they need? Because a lot of those involve helping relationships or meeting with people or listening to them or connecting them to services. So there are always community agencies who need additional help where you can be in a helping role, even if it's not talk therapy-ish, something adjacent where it requires people skills and helping. You can get a strong letter of rec that said like they're warm, they're empathetic, they have good problem solving skills, they're a team player, they have the makings of a future good counselor. So that sort of thing. What is next?
From Riley O'Sullivan, asking if we would recommend if you wanted to do private practice, would you suggest a master's in counseling or clinical psychology? Dr. Hammer, you might be best suited to explain this, just as some of the laws around that are out of my line of vision right now.
Yeah, so So psychology traditionally has been a doctoral level field. The terminal degree, like the substantive degree, is typically thought of as the doctorate. So either the PhD or the PsyD, meaning expected you're supposed to get that degree and then become a psychologist. And so if you want to practice with only a master's credential, there are a few states, such as Kentucky, as it happens, where you can get a master's in counseling psych or clinical psych, and then take a few extra classes potentially, and then be eligible for a master's level psychology credential, such as something called like a psychological associate. But only about 10 states have an option for that. Most states, if you just want to get a master's degree and go and practice talk therapy, you should go to a KCREP accredited counseling master's program. Let me show my visual here. So counseling is completely separate from psychology. I know that one of the flavors of psychology is called counseling psych, but that's a psych degree. It's completely separate from the profession of counseling. It's super confusing, but counseling is their terminal degree is a master's degree, and you can get a 3-year master's, be under supervision for a few years, and then be independently practicing. You can do a similar thing, becoming a licensed clinical social work, if you go into the social work domain. And then marriage and family therapy is another option with that too. So if you want to stop at your master's, I don't know that psychology is the best profession. Now that may change in the future because APA will be starting to accredit master's programs in psychology and applied health psychology, but that's still percolating through the system. And then the state licensure boards will still have to catch up to create credentials for master's level people to be able to practice. So that's not quite out of the oven and ready to eat yet.
This next one kind of feeds into the question directly to CC too. So I love those meld together of what would you recommend doing after undergrad before doing a master's, or would you want to go straight into a master's program, that kind of gap? I don't know everyone in the room's experience, but speaking only for myself, I also came in post-bac. So I came in before my master's, but was with Dr. Hammer throughout my experience. I took 3 years off between undergraduate and coming back for the PhD, and I would not have done it any other way. It really helped me stand on my own 2 feet as a researcher, as a professional. I came into grad school treating this like work instead of treating this like undergrad classes. And I think that has been very beneficial to me. I've seen some other people not have that mindset and it not work out quite as well. That being said, it is so personal. It is, and it has a lot to do with opportunity too. I know CC and myself both worked as research coordinators in between that transition. I had mentors who were able to give me a foot in the door for different opportunities. So it's really personal, but I would personally recommend taking that time if it makes sense for your broader life. Just because it is a huge, huge, huge commitment to go to grad school financially, emotionally, time-wise, career-wise, and you want to make sure you give yourself some intentional deep reflection before you make that choice. I'm curious what y'all did though. I don't actually know.
Joshua, you want to go next?
Sure. Well, my situation might be more on the unique side, but I had 7 years after my undergrad, and worked regionally again as a performer. And going back to my comments before, that may not be the most typical applicant, and even less so for PhD and PsyD programs. For this master's program, again, it can be a little more flexible. But can you talk about the time in between as a way that demonstrates the makings of a good clinician? So in my case, the 7 years worked on social skills, worked on other things, and it's all about how you present yourself in your application. But I would also say, thankful to take the break between school. Some people go straight in. That's also great. I appreciated the time to catch my breath.
Yeah, I would say something similar. I really appreciated the 1.5 years that I took to work after my undergrad years, because I was still in a university setting, but I was in it like in more of the research coordinator position. And I think that if I continued to go to school right after I graduated, I would have been really burnt out. And I'm really glad that I took the time to work and see myself in research capacities before committing to a whole PhD, because that also gave me the time to realize that I do want to continue research in the future. And I do see myself attending a research focused institution as opposed to just getting not just, but as opposed to getting a master's and then only doing clinical work. So I think it was a period of figuring myself out more, and I find it very helpful.
Just keeping an eye on the clock, I'm going to acknowledge some of these questions in sort of a combined way. So I see the question to me directly around billing at the doctoral versus master's level. And I see the question a little further down about what are those 10 states that Dr. Hammer was referencing. I think it's a little outside of scope here, and I don't want to give any incorrect information, but I will say that it is very nuanced and it is incredibly important to do your homework about what requirements are in what states. In terms of insurance, a very general, lots of asterisks involved, response is that oftentimes master's level clinicians can do the exact same work and bill for about half as much as a doctoral level clinician. There is nuance in that, and there's a lot of it, but insurance is its whole other game, but it is something that I am very aware of and was very aware of in making the decision to pursue a PhD rather than a master's. Skipping to the next piece of this, I think we touched on the private practice piece and licensure. Differences between the master's in social work and the LSW route rather than own private practice, rather than clinical route. Again, that is very state dependent as well. I have had too many friends attend grad school in one state and then move and have to redo clinical hours or have totally different licensing requirements. Dr. Hammer acknowledged a second ago, either or also in terms of KCREP versus APA accreditation and how those laws are actively changing. So it's a little outside of scope for the panel today to speak to too much more nuance of that, but just know that that is something to look deeply into as you're making your decisions moving forward.
Are we just about caught up on questions?
I think so.
So any last questions? Y'all got like 5-ish more minutes to post those questions, but while we wait for those, why don't we go around to each of us and like drop your biggest nugget of wisdom, drop the big thing that you want to make sure the people in this room, the people watching the recording in the future can sit with and digest. So what do you want to leave people with?
I can go first. You do not have to be tied down to it yet, but really explore your research interests. They will inform you as a future professional in this field, and you may still go into your program and it may change completely, but start poking around at those things. The other thing I would add is, again, Dr. Hammer's website answered 97% of my questions when I first started this whole process. So really take the time, take a weekend or two and just go through all the things that look interesting. You'll find that a lot of it, not just unique to UK, but to, the field as a whole, it answers a lot of questions.
Whoops. Okay. Hi, I finally unmuted myself. I think mine would be that no path that you choose will be a bad path. I think it's going to be like if you have clearly identified goals and you know what you want out of a program, I think you can make the most out of it. And your goals might change throughout, but I think it's not going to be like, I don't think that it's going to be a failed path, but I'm speaking purely from my own personal experiences. And I'm still at the beginning of my PhD journey, but I hope to see this play out in this positive way. I'm also happy to answer any questions or like go over details of like my application process and my life in general if you wanted to reach out to me over email. So I'll leave my email in the chat. And speaking of which, I also think that if you can identify certain mentors in your life and really use their expertise and their guidance when you're going through this application process, that's going to be so both like practically, but also emotionally very, very helpful.
Such good advice. I underline both of those as well. I totally agree. I don't know that I have one nugget, but I will kind of weave it into this next question I see around if you want to focus on mental illness, OCD, PTSD, anxiety, depression, is clinical or counseling a better fit? I want to speak a little bit to those differences because I think probably my biggest piece of advice is to do your homework before you go to grad school. Read the entire website. And I say that as if it's obvious, but y'all, it does not happen all of the time. Read the fine print. And one of those the reasons you want to do stuff like that is because every program's a little different, and different branches of psychology approach things a little differently as well. So this is in big generalities, but clinical psychology tends to focus a little bit more in fitting into the medical model approach, meaning from a biological perspective, a physiological perspective, they do more research on more extreme, severe mental illnesses. On the whole, there's more differences among them, but between them. Counseling psychology, we orient a little bit more towards social justice and the individual, the holistic piece, identity, how that plays into people's development of distress and how that informs treatment of that distress. We tend to do more research in that area too, around identity and more day-to-day holistic experiences. That being said, on the other side of either a clinical or counseling program, you're eligible for license for pretty much the same thing. A lot of it has to do with the approach to psychology, and those make a very big difference in terms of what opportunities you're going to get and the type of mentors and mentorship you might receive. So read the whole thing, reach out to grad students who are currently there and ask them to talk to you privately, because most of the time we're all trying to pull each other up, and we'll give you pretty honest feedback. So reach out, read the website.
Yeah, and I would add on that by saying that every learning community, every program and department at college and university has strengths and serious weaknesses. And you will never find a place that doesn't have weaknesses. And so kind of like for those of us invested in finding a life partner, it means getting to love a human being where they have strengths and weaknesses. And what's really important for fit and satisfaction and longevity is that we're at peace enough with the warts, with the weaknesses of the program, that overall the mix of strengths and weaknesses, like that soup, that combination feels worth it overall. And so students and faculty should be well positioned to talk about, this is what we're good at, this is what we're not so good at and getting better at, or this is what we're not so good at and honestly probably won't get that much better at, right? There are just some weaknesses you can't or won't do much about. So yes, people should be open to talking about their strengths and their growth edges. And if they're hesitant to talk about the weaknesses, that can be a red flag that could indicate a defensiveness to admit what we all know and have, which is weaknesses. Well, I think we did it. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Cece and Joshua and Melanie, so much for joining me on this and lending your wisdom to this. Thank you all who took the time to show up and are considering our specialty of counseling psych. I think it's a pretty cool place to be, so I hope you'll consider our specialty alongside the other lovely specialties of clinical psych and school psych and the other mental health professions. But thank you for being here. This recording will be posted to that Q&A webpage on our University of Kentucky Counseling Psych program website, so you'll be able to access the YouTube recording of that. And if you want to see these slides that were up here, which I can stop sharing now, I think I'm gonna stop sharing. You can also go to the 2021 Q&A where we go through all of the slides point by point in like 35 minutes. So thank you all for being here. I'm gonna stop recording, and then a lot of us in this room actually have a lab meeting to go to. So thank you all for being here, and hope to maybe see some of you applying to our master's or PhD programs in counseling psych this coming cycle. Thanks, y'all.